Hello. Today we are going to cover chapter 13, spinal cord and spinal nerves. So we talked about nervous tissue in chapter 12. So now we're going to talk about some of the different things that help to protect some of our nervous tissue, like the spinal cord. Our spinal cord is going to sit inside of that vertebral column. That vertebral column helps to protect that spinal cord because all of that nervous tissue, it needs a lot of protection. So that spinal cord, that brain, there's a lot of protection for both of those. Along with that vertebral column, there's ligaments, we have meninges, there's cerebral spinal fluid. This is all working to provide protection for your spinal cord. These meninges are a protective layer found inside that spinal column. They're also found in the brain, underneath the cranium or that skull. There's 3 layers. They are made of connective tissue, and they're going to wrap all the way around that spinal cord or in the brain. The same 3 layers found in the spinal cord meninges are the same 3 layers that are found in the cranial meninges. So we have our dura mater, arachnoid mater, and we have our pia mater. So let's look at some of these here. This dura mater, it is the most superficial layer. It is that dense irregular connective tissue, and it's very thick and it's very strong. It comes from that foramen magnum on the occipital bone, and it is continuous all the way to the sacrum. It is that outermost covering of the spinal cord and cranial nerves. It's kind of continuous with it. So when nerves come out of the spinal cord or nerves come off of the brain, this dura mater is continuous with that epineurium. I told you, remember that word epi from muscles? It's back. Next layer, the arachnoid mater. This arachnoid mater is the middle layer. This layer is avascular. No blood supply. This layer has more of a spider web-like arrangement or appearance. It's that middle layer. So it's underneath the dura mater, and it is continuous through that foramen magnum with the arachnoid mater of the brain. Underneath the arachnoid mater, we have this subdural space. Sub means that it is below, or no, usually sub means below, but here sub is between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. So it is below this dura mater. I was right. Sub means below. So it is below the dural space. Subdural, below the dura. So between that dura and arachnoid mater. If you just remember that sub means below, then that second part of the word dura or dural means it is below the dura mater. Now we have the pia mater. That is the innermost layer, and it lies directly on top of the spinal cord and the brain. This is squamous and cuboidal cells. It does have blood vessels because those nerves that make up the spinal cord need oxygen. The pia mater is held to the spinal cord with what are called denticulate ligaments. The subarachnoid space, again, sub means below arachnoid, below the arachnoid layer, or between the arachnoid and the pia. This is where that cerebrospinal fluid is found. The cerebrospinal fluid acts as a shock absorption. So your spinal cord is not as wide as that spinal column or spinal canal. So there's going to be those 3 different layers of meninges. There's going to be that cerebrospinal fluid in there. So it's helping to protect that spinal cord and prevent it from hitting up against the side of that spinal column when something happens, to prevent damage. Then we come to our spinal cord. This spinal cord, I drew a picture of it in the nervous tissue. We saw some pictures of it. But it goes from the medulla oblongata, which is the bottom of the brain stem. It goes to the second lumbar vertebrae in adults. Test question. In infants, it extends longer, but as we grow taller, it's going to move up. We've got 2 different enlargements within our spinal cord, and what these enlargements are areas where nerves are going to come out for the legs and the arms. So this cervical enlargement is from C4 to T1. These are where the nerves are coming out that go to your arms. The third cervical nerve down to the first thoracic nerve allow you to move your limb, your upper arm, well, your arm. The lumbosacral enlargement goes from T9 to T12. Here's the thing. The spinal cord ends at that second lumbar vertebrae. So the nerves that are coming out between T9 and T12 are those nerves that are going to travel down that spinal column and exit out at their specific levels to go to your legs. But since that spinal cord ends so high in that lumbar, that enlargement where all those nerves are coming out has to be above where the spinal cord ends. The conus medullaris, this is the tapering cone where that spinal cord ends. It's usually found between L1 and L2 vertebrae. Test question. An extension down of the spinal meninges is this filum terminale. This filum terminale helps to anchor that spinal cord to the coccyx. Then what is left after that conus medullaris is known as the cauda equina, because it looks like a horse's tail. Cauda equina means horse's tail. And this is all of the nerves after that conus medullaris. So let's look at some pictures. So we have our spinal cord. It's that kind of oval-shaped structure up here. We talked about the white matter and the gray matter. We'll go into more details about these different things, different parts of it later, but the meninges, we have the dura mater on the outside. We have the arachnoid matter in the middle, pia matter that lays directly on top of the spinal cord. The subdural space between the dura mater and the arachnoid matter, the subarachnoid space between the arachnoid matter and the pia matter. This is where we find that cerebral spinal fluid, CSF. Then we mentioned those denticulate ligaments. That is what's helping to hold the pia mater down to that spinal cord. That was it. So if we look at the actual spinal cord within that spinal column, here we can see that spinal cord, these different, the pia mater epidural space. Epi means above. Sub means below, epi means above. So we've got this epidural space above the dura. We've got that subdural space. We've got that dura mater and arachnoid matter here. See if there's anything else, but you can see all this extra space, color that stands out somewhat, between these meninges, the spinal cord. This is that subarachnoid space that I colored in. That's where that cerebral spinal fluid is. So there's a lot going on in here. I also mentioned the end of the spinal cord. This is one of my pictures that I found. This is a really good dissection of a spinal cord. So this is, I want a better color here. Red. Didn't do what I wanted. Nope. I want it to stand out. This is that conus medullaris, this point at the end of that spinal cord. That's what that conus medullaris is. Coming down, this portion that is coming down is that filum terminale. All of these nerves here, these nerves will come down and they are going to form that cauda equina. I was looking for a picture for it, but a drawing, I should say. We've got some later on in this PowerPoint, and we'll get to see it in lab. So something interesting, a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture. Anybody who's ever had a baby, ever had CSF withdrawn for any kind of testing like meningitis, they do this spinal tap or lumbar puncture. They send a needle into that subarachnoid space, and they are taking out that cerebral spinal fluid. Or they could introduce antibiotics in there for people who have meningitis because it's some sort of infection of the meninges. They can even put some kind of dye so they can get a better view of the spinal cord. Anesthetics. Those who've had an epidural before, what they're doing is numbing everything. They do it through a spinal tap, chemotherapy. And they also do it to measure that cerebral spinal fluid pressure. So when they do these spinal taps, they're going to do it below the L2 vertebrae. Why? Because at that L2, we have this conus medullaris. We do not want to hit the spinal cord. So all of these nerves coming down here, this is that cauda equina. This cauda equina is not as dense or thick as this spinal cord is, So this allows them to stick a needle in and work with this cerebral spinal fluid without any damage to the spinal cord. So let's look at our spinal nerves. Our spinal nerves is how information gets out of our spinal cord out to the rest of our body. We use these spinal nerves. We have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Test question. There's 8 cervical nerves, C1 to C8, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal nerve. So let's look at this picture for a second. So we have 8 cervical vertebrae, nerves, sorry. 7 cervical vertebrae, 8 cervical nerves. C1 nerve comes out above the C1 vertebrae. This is the one nerve that does not come out through an intervertebral foramen. Test question. C2 comes out above the C2 vertebrae. C3 comes out above the C3 vertebrae. C4 comes out above. C5, C6, and C7 all come out above its matching vertebrae. C8 comes out below the C7 vertebrae. From C8 on, all of these nerves come out below the matching vertebrae number. So T1 nerve comes out below T1 vertebrae. T2 nerve comes out below T2 vertebrae, and so on, all the way through the lumbar. The sacral foramina, those sacral foramina, each one is where a sacral nerve is going to come out through each of those sacral foramina. So our spinal nerves, all of our spinal nerves are going to have roots. This is what connects that spinal nerve to that specific segment of the spinal cord. They have this little area that is known as rootlets. We have posterior roots and rootlets. Posterior is carrying sensory. So this is information coming into the spinal cord. This information is coming from sensory receptors in the skin, muscles, and organs, and it goes into the spinal cord. As these posterior roots come in, we have a dorsal root ganglion. Dorsal means posterior. So this is the cell bodies of the sensory neurons. Test question. Then we have our anterior roots and rootlets. This is motor neurons. So this is information going out. This is that information going from the brain to those muscles or glands. So as the spinal nerve comes out of that spinal column, they're going to pass through that intervertebral foramen at that area. I want my picture of the spinal cord up here. So let's start going into this. We have back here are my posterior rootlets. Here is my anterior See, all these little fibers are what make it those rootlets. Here is my dorsal root ganglion. This is where all of the cell bodies of my sensory neurons that are going into the spinal cord are going. The information coming out comes out the front. We'll go through that again as it comes up again, because it will continue to come up again. Went through that picture already. So we talked about a little bit in the last chapter that white matter is mostly myelinated axons. That gray matter, shaped in a letter H or a butterfly, whichever one you decide it looks like. This is dendrites, cell bodies, unmyelinated axons, and neuroglia, so those support cells. So our actual spinal cord, we have an anterior median fissure. This is a groove on the front of the spinal cord. We have a posterior median sulcus. The fissure is deeper, the sulcus is not. This is a furrow on the back side. We have this gray commissure. This is what forms the crossbar of that H. It connects the right and the left sides of that spinal cord together. There is a central canal. This travels the entire length of that spinal cord, and it is filled with cerebral spinal fluid. We have our anterior white commissure. This is what connects the white matter of the right and the left side of the spinal cord. Because the right side of your body is controlled by the left side of your brain. The left side of your body is controlled by the right side of your brain. So there has to be an area where this information can travel from one side to the next. So let's look at some of this. We talked about, here's that spinal nerve. There's that posterior dorsal root ganglion. I mentioned the posterior roots, and those rootlets are those little fiber portions. Here's that anterior root, and those anterior rootlets, looking for where they were named. Okay, that anterior median fissure is this large portion that goes here. The posterior, lost it, posterior median sulcus. It's not as deep, kind of runs in, and that's it. Mention that, whoops, gray commissure. That is this section right here that connects that right and that left side. And then we have that central canal. That central canal here, it's this opening here where cerebral spinal fluid traverses that entire pathway. What was the last one? The anterior white commissure. So that anterior white commissure is this area right in here. This is an area where information could travel from one side of the spinal cord to another. So within this spinal cord, when we get closer up to the actual brain, the brain stem, we mentioned a nuclei yesterday. It is a collection of cell bodies within the central nervous system. So they will be found in the spinal cord and the brain. So we have sensory, and then we also have motor. Sensory receives input, motor gives us that output. On our spinal cord, we have horns. This is made of that gray matter. We have an anterior and a posterior. So let's come, I went my wrong way. So, and we have a lateral. So here's that anterior gray horn. Is this area through here. We have our posterior gray horn, which is this area in the back. And then in the thoracic area only, we have a lateral gray horn. It's going to be this little kind of bump through here. This is where we find more autonomic type functions that are going out to maybe those erector pili muscles in your skin that causes goosebumps. Could be going down to your digestive tract, your reproductive tract, your urinary system, but that is this lateral gray horn is where that information gets sent out to. Or it could be for your heart or your lungs even. So I showed where they were. Let's look at them now. So that posterior gray horn is incoming sensory. It does have cell bodies and it does have interneurons, those kind of between neurons. Then we have the anterior gray horn. This is motor. Contains that motor nuclei. And then those motor neurons that are leaving that spinal cord to go to those skeletal muscles. Then I mentioned that lateral gray horn. Only in the thoracic. Some people have it in that upper lumbar because we only have L1 and L2, that spinal cord, and that's it. But this is autonomic nuclei. So this is going to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. Autonomic is always, when we're talking about output, it's smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Last question. So this purple drawn in here, that is that interneuron. So that between what's going in and what's going out. You can also see this dorsal root ganglion here that has that pseudo-unipolar or unipolar neuron that has that cell body kind of off to the side. That cell body off to the side is in that dorsal root ganglion. So here, this is part of that lumbar. I mean, the picture is showing the cervical for some odd reason, and then this label is saying lumbar, so whatever. But we can see like that anterior median fissure, how deep it is versus that posterior median sulcus. You see the posterior gray horn, the anterior gray horn, you see the lateral gray horn, the gray commissure, we've mentioned the central canal. Now we're going to talk about the white regions. That white matter. It is made up of funiculi or funiculus. We have anterior, posterior, and lateral funiculi. What these funiculi or funiculus are, they are bundles of axons that are traveling in tracks. These tracks are pathways for the neurons that are sending that information up to the brain, or where that brain is going to send information down to go to your skeletal muscles, smooth muscle, or glands. So the different types of tracks. We have sensory tracts or ascending. So this is that information that is going towards the brain. We have our motor or descending tract. This is going away from the brain. So it goes from the brain down to its destination. These sensory tracts and motor tracts are going to be found in this posterior white column. That's another name for the funniculus is columns. Lateral white column and these anterior white columns. So this whole area is the posterior. We have lateral. And then we have those anterior. So our spinal cord has an organization to it that allows this information to get to where it needs to go. So it's going to allow sensory information to come in, go up to the brain, process it, and go back out. But our spinal cord can also process information. This information may go up to the brain so it knows what is happening, but your spinal cord can also process sensory information coming in and send out that motor output. So we get this sensory stimulus. Somebody touches you. It's raining. You feel raindrops on you. You step outside and it's cold or it's hot. The sensory information is going to send in this information. So this information is going to go in through that, follow along that sensory neuron. That sensory neuron is going to take this information through those posterior roots. And they're going to carry this information one of three ways, possible paths. It can enter the posterior gray horn and go into the white matter and go up to the brain, traveling through one of those sensory tracts. It can synapse with an interneuron that extends into the white matter, then goes up to the brain. So, drawing. So I have my spinal cord. I have information coming in. I have this information coming in. It's going to synapse with another neuron who is then going to take that information up to the brain. That's my other option. My last option, it can enter that posterior gray horn. It can synapse with an interneuron that synapses with the motor neuron. And this is how our spinal reflexes work. I mentioned before that patellar reflex, when they hit that patellar tendon with that reflex hammer, and if they hit it right, your leg kicks out. That's a type of reflex. Reflexes are processed in the spinal cord and sent right back out. this picture. So if we follow this blue sensory information coming in, it synapses with this purple interneuron. Its response, what I wanted, is this sensory red information coming out. That is how a reflex works. We'll talk about other types of reflexes later, but that is how these reflexes work. Is this information goes into the spinal cord, it gets processed in the spinal cord through these interneurons, and then it sends this information right back out. So motor information. I know these slides have a lot of information on them. There's just a lot of information in your book about this. So that motor is going to come out through somatic motor neurons. If they're going to skeletal muscle, they come out that anterior gray horn. Most of those somatic motor neurons are regulated by the brain. So when they're activated, they're going to send information as those action potentials or those impulses along those axons. It'll pass through that anterior gray horn, through those anterior roots, enter that spinal nerve, and then those axons will go to those skeletal muscles to tell that skeletal muscle to contract. Motor output can also go to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. That is through autonomic motor neurons that are in that lateral gray horn that I had mentioned before. So from a spinal nerve, the axons of autonomic neurons, they will synapse with another group of autonomic neurons located somewhere in that peripheral nervous system. We'll talk about that more when we get to the autonomic nervous system, how that all works. But autonomic neurons tend to synapse with more neurons before they get to their target organ. That's introducing it. When we get to the autonomic nervous system, we'll see how that works. So this shows all of the different options. We have these sensory inputs from your skin in blue over here. The sensory information goes in through the back of the spinal cord, and it can go one of three directions. It can go straight up. It can cross to the other side to the white, go up, or it can go into the spinal cord, process through an interneuron. That'll go out. Skeletal muscle. This information will come down the white, jump into the gray before it goes out. And that autonomic. That autonomic will come out through that lateral gray horn. It'll synapse with an autonomic motor neuron and then go to one of its target organs. So here's our spinal cord at the many different segments. What is happening in these different segments? Picture from, nice chart from your book. So let's look at spinal nerves exactly. What are they? A spinal nerve are bundles of axons. And again, they are wrapped in connective tissue. They're going to connect to that central nervous system somehow. They have those posterior roots and those anterior roots that are going to come together and form that spinal nerve. Again, posterior carries sensory, anterior is motor. Spinal nerves are mixed nerves. It's a mixed nerve in that it carries both sensory and motor information in this same nerve. So when I mentioned in skeletal muscles that you're going to see this endo, peri, epi again, here it is. This is the last time you'll see it in anatomy 1. You will see it again in anatomy 2. So endo means it's the innermost layer, neurium, nerve. Neurium tells us we're wrapped around nerves this time. So that endoneurium is that innermost layer that is going to be wrapped around each individual axon. Just like our skeletal muscles, our spinal nerve is grouped into fascicles. These fascicles are held together by the perineurium. This is what forms that fascicle, and it's that middle layer. Then we have our epineurium. This is that outermost that covers the entire spinal nerve. We're talking about the meninges earlier. It's part of those spinal meninges that kind of fuses out with that epineurium. So let's look at a spinal nerve. That epineurium wraps around that entire nerve. We form that nerve fascicle with that perineurium that separates out a group of nerve axons. Each axon is wrapped in its own endoneurium. Just like skeletal muscle fibers is the same as in nerves. Here is a really cool electron micrograph of a spinal nerve. This is both sensory and motor axons within this entire spinal nerve. So we can see that endoneurium around each individual axon, that perineurium that is being formed by this fascicle through here. And then we have our epineurium that makes the entire, wraps around that entire nerve fascicle. We mentioned before there's blood supply inside one of these spinal nerves. Why? All of these axons here, they need nutrients. So our spinal nerves, when they leave the spine, that spinal cord, they come out past the vertebrae, we're going to create different branches off of there. This spinal nerve is going to branch off many different directions. So we create rami. We have a posterior ramus. Posterior means it's going to the posterior portion of your trunk. This is what's going to give most of your deep muscles in your back and even some of the skin on your back are going to be given either that sensation or motor by that posterior ramus. We have an anterior ramus. This anterior ramus, it's going to be for upper and lower limbs. So this is going to feed your arms and your legs. It's also going to go to the skin, to the anterior and lateral portions of your trunk. And then we have a meningeal branch. Think about it, those meninges, those spinal meninges, that wrap around that spinal cord. This nerve comes out through that spinal nerve. It re-enters that vertebral canal, and it actually goes in through that intervertebral foramen, and it's going to give that vertebrae, those ligaments, blood vessels, and meninges. So it gives sensation to what's back inside that vertebral column. And then we have communicating rami. This is where we get into the autonomic nervous system. We mentioned it here. We are going to go into what these actually mean and do when we actually get to the chapter on the autonomic nervous system. They're also called rami communicants. So let's look at some of these. Here we have our spinal cord. We have our spinal nerve coming out. So the spinal nerve. Here you can see that posterior ramus coming off. This nerve that is going into the back. Go feeding those muscles into your back, and then they'll go to the skin. The anterior ramus is the rest of this nerve. So this area that continues off is that anterior ramus. From here, we have that meningeal branch. This is the one that comes off, and it's going to go right back into that spinal column. We have them on both sides, so it goes right back into that spinal column. We even have one that comes up through the front, this meningeal branch. Now, these are our communicating rami. So this is where all of our autonomic information is going to go. This is an autonomic ganglion here. We'll go into more details about all of that, what it does, when we get to the autonomic nervous system, but that is where some of these go, where these go, what these do. That posterior ramus just branches off that spinal nerve and just goes to the back. Test question. We have a lot of plexuses that come off of our spinal cord. A plexus is a group of nerves that join together, may branch off somewhere else, join together again. And the purpose behind these plexuses is so that there's more than one nerve root that it goes to something. Best example, your diaphragm, the muscle we use to breathe. The diaphragm has nerve roots from C3, C4, and C5. So if something happens to C5, we still have C3 and C4 that helps us to breathe. If something happens to C5 and C4, we still have C3 that'll help us breathe. So there's more than one nerve root that is going to some of these very important structures to help maintain function. So all of our nerves except T2 to T12 will form some form of plexus. T2 to T12 just wrap around the trunk, so they don't go directly to your arms, your legs, your diaphragm. So we're going to go through all of these different plexuses, and we'll go through some of the main nerves off of these plexuses that you need to know. So I mentioned those T2 to T12 above that do not form a plexus. These make up what are known as our intercostal nerves, costal ribs. So these are the nerves that are going to go to structures around that intercostal space. Here's kind of an idea where some of these sit, like T2 will go around that skin to the axilla, that armpit. T3 to T6 will kind of go to that lateral chest wall, this anterior skin. T7 to T12, those abdominal muscles. T10, just kind of as a estimate of kind of how these nerves wrap around, go to that umbilicus or belly button. And how those work, and they wrap around, they form what are known as dermatomes. A dermatome is actually the area of skin that provides sensory information for one pair of spinal nerves. So like where T10 nerve provides sensory, that's by the umbilicus, wraps around to the umbilicus. Or it's also for that trigeminal nerve, because that trigeminal nerve gives, it's a cranial nerve that gives sensory information to our face. So knowing these dermatomes and the pattern these dermatomes follow, like what area of skin is covered by which nerve, can actually help figure out where there is damage at the spinal cord. Figuring out where somebody has lost sensation, you can figure out you can trace that back to the spinal cord to find that damage. So let's look at this dermatomal chart. Thank you for getting larger. So as I mentioned, that trigeminal nerve does the face. But if we look at the thoracic, you can see how these thoracic kind of wrap around. They also, T1 and T2 will go to the arm. I mentioned T10 is around that umbilicus. You can see C4 does the top of the shoulder. C5 does down a little further. C6 is going to go down to that thumb and second finger. C6, or I said C6, C7 is that middle finger. C8 is that little finger and part of that ring finger. So knowing this information, you can figure out if somebody says they've lost sensation on the whole top part of their arm, it could be you can kind of trace it back and figure out, well, did they lose sensation of their shoulder? Did they lose sensation of just their forearm? Do they have sensation in their fingers? Which fingers do or do not? You can figure out if it's C5, C6. You can figure out where this nerve damage could be. Or down the legs, like C3 here, or L3, sorry. L4, L5, and then into that S1. You can see S1 is at bottom of that foot as well. So you can see how this all can figure out where there's possible nerve damage just based on this sensory kind of information. So let's start looking at our different plexuses. Our cervical plexus, it is C1 to C4. Sometimes there's C5. It just depends. Well, because C5 or yeah, because C5 technically goes to the phrenic nerve, which is the nerve that goes to the diaphragm. And that nerve comes out of the cervical plexus, listed right here. So that phrenic nerve goes down to the diaphragm. That is what it lets us breathe. But this Cervical plexus is going to supply the skin and muscles of the head and neck and the upper shoulders, even down into like the upper chest. So these different nerves that kind of come off of the cervical plexus, the main one that you need to know, the phrenic nerve. And I said it's C3, C4, C5. The little saying that I learned that helped me was C3, 4, 5 keeps you alive. If it works, great. If not, oh well. So we can see how these plexuses look. You can see C1 here coming down. You can see how C2 can join up with parts of C3, which join up with parts of C1. C3 will join down to C4. That C3 here, C4, C5. Now we have our phrenic nerve. So you can see how these branches all kind of come together, break apart, come together different ways to form all of these different nerves. Off of the cervical plexus, it's just the main nerve that you really need to know is that phrenic nerve. So injuries to that phrenic nerve, I already kind of mentioned that when I talked about how a plexus works, but C3, C4, and C5 keep you alive by allowing you to breathe. So if that spinal cord gets severed, gets sliced up, gets cut, as long as it is below the origin where that phrenic nerve comes out, you can still breathe. If it is above C3, that's phrenic nerve, it's going to cause respiratory arrest. You are not going to be able to breathe because there's nothing telling your diaphragm to contract to allow you to breathe in. There's a lot of things that can cause damage to that phrenic nerve as well, like tracheal or esophageal tumors can actually put pressure on that phrenic nerve and cause it to stop working. Next plexus, brachial plexus. This one is probably the most complex and the most nerves you need to know off of it because this is going to your arms. It's C5 to C8 and T1 make up this brachial plexus. So this plexus specifically is broken up into different parts. We start with the roots, where each spinal nerve coming out has its own roots. So C5, C6, C7, C8, T1. They're going to connect together to form trunks. Then they're going to split apart or connect to something else to form divisions, then cords, then branches. So here's all of the nerves that come off of this brachial plexus. You do not need to know all of them. I will go through the ones you need to know. First one, musculocutaneous. Biceps brachii. This is the one that lets you flex your forearm. Median nerve. This goes to most of your forearm flexors. It runs down the front of your arm, down the middle. This is the nerve. It goes through a little tunnel through by those carpal bones to get out to your hand. So this is the nerve that gets compressed in carpal tunnel syndrome. Radial nerve. This goes down the back of your arm. So it goes to those triceps. It allows you to straighten your arm. It also goes to the lateral 3.5 digits. So that pinky, that ring finger, and part of that middle finger. Last one, ulnar nerve. Ulnar nerve is going to go to follow that ulnar side of the bone. So it's going to be that medial 1.5 digits, skin of the medial side of the hand, most of the muscles of the hand. If you ever hit your funny bone, it's your ulnar nerve. That's the bone, that's the nerve that you're tingling right when you hit your funny bone. So here's this brachial plexus. We have our roots, C5 root, C6, C7, C8, and T1. They come together to form trunks. They're going to split apart to form cords or divisions, then cords, then branches. You don't have to go that far into it. When I took my graduate anatomy class, I had to be able to draw this out going all the way down the arm. So just be glad you're not going there. So here's this brachial plexus as it goes all the way down the arm. There's that musculocutaneous nerve that is going to that biceps brachii, that radial nerve that wraps around and goes behind the arm, the median nerve that literally goes down the middle of the arm all the way down, and then that ulnar nerve that is going down that medial side. You can see, I just colored it in, let me delete that. Right here, how this goes on, this ulnar nerve goes underneath that medial epicondyle of the humerus. That's why when you hit that medial epicondyle of the humerus, it kind of gives that stinging, kind of weird sensation. That's your funny bone you're hitting. That's that ulnar nerve. Yes. So there's a lot of different conditions that affect the brachial plexus. Erb's Duchenne palsy. You'll see this in football players because they force, or it could be from childbirth even, but a forceful pulling away of the head from the shoulder. So like landing on your shoulder upside down with your head tilted to the side, excessive stretching during childbirth. They kind of have this, what's known as waiter's tip, like the hand behind you, but your shoulder's kind of abducted in, your hand is rotated behind, and their arm is kind of stuck in that position. Radial nerve injury. If an injection into the arm is not done into that deltoid correctly, it can hit the radial nerve. They get wrist drop because that radial nerve travels down the back of your arm. So it's going to a lot of those extensors, allows you to extend your wrist up. And if you can't extend your wrist drops. So it gives you that inability to extend those wrists. Next one, median nerve palsy. That median nerve palsy is that another kind of carpal tunnel syndrome. So you get this numbness and tingling, can be pain too, in your palm of your hand or your lateral 3.5 digits. You cannot pronate. Put your hand face down. You have weak wrist flexion because that median nerve goes to a lot of those wrist flexors. Your thumb movement is also weak because that median nerve goes to your thumb. Ulnar nerve palsy. You cannot abduct or adduct your fingers. You can lose sensation over those medial 1.5 digits. These people get, or here's wrist drop. They can't put their hand back up. Median nerve palsy, their hand is kind of in this kind of claw, this kind of fist, almost like. Then there's ulnar nerve palsy, that kind of claw hand, as it's calling it. Long thoracic nerve. This is one I didn't mention that you guys needed to know. But this goes specifically to that serratus anterior muscle. That serratus anterior muscle actually attaches to your scapula. So it's going to cause this winged scapula. So that scapula appears to be winged out. So the way to tell if somebody has a winged scapula, you can see it like physically like sticking out a lot more on this right side than the left. You have somebody put their hands up and push against the wall. Pushing up against the wall activates that serratus anterior, and it should help to hold that scapula to your thoracic cage. Somebody who has a long thoracic nerve injury, they can't do that right. So their scapula kind of protrudes off. Last one. Doing it again. Thoracic outlet syndrome. As a chiropractor, I see this every so often in my office, and it has to do with compression of the brachial plexus or the blood supply. So back up here to this brachial plexus. You can see how this brachial plexus goes underneath the clavicle. There's a lot of muscles in the neck that are coming out in this area that can actually kind of compress and squeeze down on those nerves as well. So these people, as it says, it can result from a spasm of the scalene muscles, the pectoralis minor muscles, just because of where they come in. It's an anomaly, but some people have what are known as cervical ribs. Cervical ribs is where they have small ribs that are coming off of their C7 vertebrae. These people can have pain and numbness, weakness, tingling in their arm. It can be exaggerated during physical or emotional stress because a lot of the times what causes this thoracic outlet syndrome, besides poor posture, that's one of them, but a lot of stress. People, when they carry stress, it tends to bring on a lot of tension in their muscles. And by causing this excess tension in their muscles, it can compress down on nerves and cause different symptoms. Thoracic outlet syndrome is one of them. Lumbar plexus. The lumbar plexus is L1 to L4. The lumbar plexus goes down the front of the leg. So that lumbar plexus specifically goes down the front of the leg. The femoral nerve is the largest nerve coming out of that lumbar plexus, test question. And it is going down the front of that leg. So here's that femoral nerve. It is coming down this front aspect of the leg. The front of the leg. So injuries to that femoral nerve. That femoral nerve is a lot more superficial than people seem to think. So it can occur in stabs or gunshot wounds to the front of the leg. So these people can't extend their leg. They can lose sensation over the front of their leg. The other nerve is there's this obturator nerve. There it is, obturator nerve. Or here, obturator nerve. It kind of comes in and goes out this way. So that obturator nerve, some people get lucky enough that that fetal head sits on that obturator nerve during pregnancy. So then those adductors, the middle of the leg muscles, aren't going to work. They'll lose sensation. Something where you try to get that kid to reposition themselves because it's not a comfortable sensation to have. Okay, our sacral plexus. The sacral plexus is from L4, L5, and S1 to S4. This one comes out the back. The back side. We have the sciatic nerve that comes out of the sacral plexus. This is the largest nerve in the body. So come back up. This nerve coming out the back here, this is that sciatic nerve. Our last plexus is that coccygeal plexus. S4 to S5 and those coccygeal nerves. This just kind of supplies the nerves that come out at this area pretty much supply the skin and or structures, muscles directly in that area. So right behind the sacrum, right behind that lower sacrum, right behind the coccyx, right in that area is where these nerves are feeding into. So here we can see this sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve is made up of this tibial nerve and this common fibular nerve. Test question. So as this sciatic nerve comes down just above the back of the knee, the sciatic nerve will split and we will get that fibular nerve, common fibular nerve, and that tibial nerve. And then that common fibular nerve. So knowing what that sciatic nerve splits off into is a good thing. So the most common form of back pain is compression of that sciatic nerve. And here's an interesting thing. So we have this kind of triangular shaped muscle in our gluteal region that's called the piriformis, which is also listed right here. In that piriformis, 15% of the population, that nerve is going to come out. Let me draw better. So we have this, and I'm going to draw it bigger so we can see. 15% of the population, this nerve comes out right through the middle of this muscle. That's in about 15% of the population. The rest of the population, this nerve is going to come out underneath the piriformis, or it can come out above the piriformis. Everybody is different, but this sciatica is pain, numbness, tingling that goes from the buttocks down the posterior and into the lateral aspect of the leg and the lateral aspect of the foot. What can cause this? Could be a herniated disc, dislocated hip, osteoarthritis in the spine, could be a shortening of the rotator cuff muscles, that piriformis, that shortening, those rotator cuff muscles is that piriformis right there. Pressure during pregnancy, inflammation. There's a lot of things. Here, males sitting on a wallet for long periods of time can compress that sciatic nerve. One more condition, foot drop that goes with the sacral plexus. This is a damage or something that happens to this common fibular nerve. Because this common fibular nerve goes to those foot flexors, or those muscles that allow you to dorsiflex your foot. So if you cannot dorsiflex your foot, when you go to take a step, instead of rolling through your foot, because you land on your heel when you walk, and then you roll through to your toes where you push off, you're going to land flat-footed. And then when you take your next step, you're going to land flat-footed. That's foot drop because you cannot pick your toes up off of the ground. Here's a chart of a lot of these different nerves that come out of these different plexuses. So let's go back and talk about the spinal cord and these different sensory and motor tracts. I'm not going to expect you to know the specific names of these sensory and motor tracts, but knowing that these exist will be helpful. So these different tracts are found in the white matter of that spinal cord. There's going to be tracts that are taking information up to the brain. There's going to be different tracts that take information from the brain down the spinal cord. So as you can see between the red and the green, or the blue, sorry, that blue is sensory, so that is information that is going up to the brain. And then these red are all motor information coming back down. So there's different tracts that are going to carry different types of information. Like the spinal thalamic tract. This is what allows you to feel pain. This tract carries temperature, itch, and tickle. The posterior funiculi is going to carry touch, vibration, pressure, and that conscious proprioception. So you consciously knowing where your joints are in space. So motor output goes to your, most of it goes to your skeletal muscles. So we have different pathways for that. Motor tracts. We have direct pathways. We have pyramidal, lateral cortical spinal, anterior cortical spinal, and corticobulbar tracts that are carrying these direct information. And this direct information is voluntary movement. We have indirect pathways. These are extrapyramidal pathways. So the rubrospinal, tectospinal, vestibulospinal, lateral reticulospinal, medial reticulospinal tracts. The nice thing is they tell you where they're going. Corticospinal, cortex to the spine. Rubrospinal, rubro is one of the nuclei down to the spine. Tectospinal is going from one of those nuclei in the brainstem down the spine. And a lot of this is carrying these indirect is autonomic movements, but they also help coordinate your body movements with what you're visually seeing. So you see something in front of you that you need to go around. So it plans out and sends that information so you can step and walk around something you're seeing. It also helps to maintain your muscle tone. Postural muscles, equilibrium. So let's look at some of these reflexes. I mentioned reflexes before. Now we're going to go into some good detail about reflexes, because reflexes are an involuntary, unplanned sequence of actions that are going to occur in response to a stimulus. So some are inborn. Like when you touch something hot, you pull your hand away. You step on something sharp, you pull your foot away. Others we learn, like driving becomes a reflex. Slamming on those brakes is actually a reflex. So I mentioned the spinal reflex. That is that patellar reflex, that knee jerk. There's also one for biceps, triceps, brachioradialis, finger flexors. There's hamstrings, there's Achilles. There's several of these different spinal reflexes. We have cranial reflexes, like cracking something when you read. That is a cranial reflex. Somatic involves your skeletal muscles because somatic means muscle. And autonomic is going to be smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. We only have one reliable autonomic reflex in our body. And that would be when you shine a bright light in somebody's eye and their pupil of their eye constricts, gets smaller. That is an autonomic reflex. That is the only reliable reflex, autonomic reflex that we can actually check. So we're going to look at this reflex arc and what is happening along the way. So for a reflex to happen, we have to have this sensory input. So this sensory input goes in through the central nervous system, follows certain pathways, and it's going to provide that motor output. So here is an example of stepping on a nail. That sensory information, you just stepped on a nail, goes into that spinal cord. This interneuron here is going to process that, and it's going to send information back out, telling you to move your foot, pick your foot back up. That hurt. So this goes through this entire process. This sensory receptor, this is whatever is picking up that stimulus. Again, just like we talked about in chapter 12, it has to be a large enough stimulus to reach that threshold to generate that nerve impulse or action potential. When that happens, that sensory neuron will send that action potential, that information into the spinal cord. It will connect with an interneuron. this interneuron is going to process this information and it'll connect to this motor neuron that is going to relay out a response. This motor neuron is going to send this information to an effector, which is usually some sort of skeletal muscle. Like for that patellar reflex, that skeletal muscle, that quadricep muscle is going to contract, and that's what causes your knee to kick out. Since reflexes are a normal response, they are predictable. So this is how we can determine if there's some kind of damage or disease to the nervous system. Like that patellar reflex, if it is absent, it could be there's damage to the sensory or motor neurons, or there's damage in the spinal cord. So we have this stretch reflex that are using or that are found within skeletal muscles, that effector, that response, they are monitoring the stretch of your muscles. So we have these what are known as muscle spindles that are our sensory receptors in our skeletal muscles here. So this blue neuron or nerve, same thing. Right here, it is a stretch receptor or a muscle spindle that is detecting any kind of stretch on a muscle. Hitting this patellar tendon actually causes a slight stretch in this muscle. The stretching in this muscle is going to cause this quadricep muscle to contract. But here's the cool thing about all of this. Come over here to the spinal cord for a minute. So the sensory neuron, when it sends this information in, it needs to send this information up to the brain so you're aware of what's happening. If it does not go up to the brain, you are not aware that something is happening. This will come in handy when we talk about the brain in the next chapter. So another place this information is going, it's going over, the sensory information is going to connect to this motor neuron to tell this muscle here to contract. Here's the interesting thing. It's going to connect to this interneuron that is going to send this information out to inhibit those hamstrings, meaning we want those hamstrings to relax so that this quadricep muscle up here can contract and cause the leg to kick out. All of this is happening just by hitting that patellar tendon. Information's going up to the brain. This information goes out to that quadricep muscle to contract. Information goes to the hamstrings on the opposite side of the leg to relax. So these muscle spindles, they are monitoring the length of your muscles at all time. So when they are stretched, it's going to cause these muscles to contract through this stretch reflex. And this just goes through the entire step-by-step process if you want to sit down and read it. So we have different types of reflex arcs. Ipsilateral. Remember back to chapter 1, ipsilateral means it's on the same side. So that sensory information goes into that spinal cord on the same side from the motor neuron that leaves. This is monosynaptic, meaning it goes through one neuron. So the brain is going to regulate those muscle spindle sensitivity. So this is what makes sure those muscle spindles are sending the correct information about the length of those muscles during voluntary and reflex contractions. It can adjust how vigorously a muscle spindle will respond to a stretch, and that is setting that muscle tone. So this reflex helps prevent injury by overstretching the muscles. That is what these muscle spindles are trying to do. So a polysynaptic. This is 3 neurons and 2 synapses. Poly means many. So we have that axon from that muscle spindle, sensory, that is going to an inhibitory neuron in that integrating center. That interneuron is going to inhibit those antagonistic muscles. So those muscles on the opposite side of that arm or that leg from that reflex. So when that stretched muscle contracts, those antagonistic muscles relax, which is what I explained in this picture up here. We need the hamstrings to relax so these quadricep muscles can contract. Our muscles have this reciprocal innervation, and its job is to prevent conflicts. So those opposing muscles, making sure that they do what they're supposed to do. They can help maintain your posture. So if you've ever been, when you're standing, you kind of rock back and forth between the balls of your feet and your heels back and forth. All of a sudden you lean too far forward. The muscles in the back of your leg, that gastrocnemius, will contract to help try to keep you standing up instead of falling forward on your face. That is part of this reciprocal innervation of the stretch reflex. Now a tendon reflex. We mentioned those stretch receptors in those muscles. Well, we have tendon organs or Golgi tendons, that's how I learned it, that are found in the tendons that also give this feedback about that tension on that muscle and that tension on that tendon, because we're trying to prevent our tendons from also tearing at this point. They're not as sensitive as those stretch reflexes and those muscle, but they still give input. So, thank you. These tendon organs here in this tendon, they are also monitoring the tension or the pull on that tendon when it looks like they did a hamstring reflex this time. So in a hamstring reflex, yes, your foot is going to go backwards. So we're monitoring that stretch when that foot kicks backwards. That tendon organ is monitoring the length of that and tension on that tendon, just like those muscle spindles are also monitoring the stretch on that muscle. And this information always needs to go to the brain so you're aware of what is happening. Went through all of that, just about. So let's look at some other types of reflexes here. We have a flexor reflex or a withdrawal reflex. The best example, touching something hot on a stove, pulling your hand away, you're flexing your elbow, you're bending your arm. That's a flexor reflex. Or you step on something on the ground, you pull your leg off. That is a flexor reflex. This one, this person kicked a nail or stepped into a nail. So in this flexor reflex, this sensory neuron is sending this information up into the spinal cord at that specific spinal level that was stimulated. We go to this interneuron, which is now going to send information up or down that spinal cord because we need to activate the correct muscles at the correct levels so this person can move their foot away from that nail they just stepped on. So that's where this flexor reflex, this just goes through the step-by-step process of what is happening. This information goes into the spinal cord. It's going to travel up or down certain levels so we can activate the correct nerves at the correct spinal levels that go to those muscles to allow the correct muscles to contract to pull your foot away while also inhibiting the other muscles, the quadriceps, so you can move your foot. We have some others. We have that ipsilateral, and that means just the same side. The information going in that one side goes out the same side. We have intersegmental, which is kind of what we talked about here, because that information needs to travel up and down different segments of that spinal cord to activate the correct effectors so you can pull your leg off of whatever nail you stepped on. And then we have cross extensor. Why? Okay, so this foot over here, we talked about it. They stepped on a nail. That sensory receptor was activated when you step on a nail. That sensory information goes into the spinal cord. Information needs to travel up and down that spinal cord on the same side. So those hamstrings on that same leg will contract to pull your foot away. But here's the interesting part. This information also needs to go to the other side of the spinal cord. So it goes through that great commissure in the middle. Then it's going to travel up and down to those effectors on the opposite leg. Because when you pull your foot, your right foot off of the ground, your left leg needs to catch you. So when you pick up that right foot, you don't fall over. The muscles on the left leg need to contract to catch you so you stay standing. That is this cross extensor reflex. This is what helps you maintain your balance when you're pulling the opposite leg off the ground so you can stay standing. Requires both sides to work. If one side is not working, say if that left side's not working, but you pull that right foot away, you're going to fall over. That's just how it works. So this goes through the step-by-step what is happening in those cross extensor reflexes, but it's just sending information to both sides of the spinal cord so the correct muscles can contract to number one, pull your leg away. Number two, you can maintain your balance. So I mentioned that patellar reflex many times, hitting that patellar tendon. Well, this reflex can be blocked by damage. That is either the nerve that goes to that specific patellar tendon, usually around L4. Those integrating centers, that second, third, and fourth lumbar segment. People with chronic diabetes or neurosyphilis they may have completely absent reflexes. You hit that patellar tendon and nothing happens. And that is because people with chronic, uncontrolled diabetes, these are people who do not control their blood sugar, their nerves start to degenerate, so they don't work right. Neurosyphilis, same thing. It's that sexually transmitted infection, syphilis, that gets into your nervous system. It does happen. People can have an exaggerated reflex, like larger than normal, and it has to do with higher centers in the brain that are going to that spinal cord level. The Achilles reflex. This is where you hit that Achilles tendon and the foot plantar flexes. So your foot technically moves down towards the ground. If this reflex is absent, there could be damage to the nerves going to that Achilles tendon or that lumbosacral region, because this is coming out of the back of the leg. So it's that sacral plexus. Again, chronic diabetes, neurosyphilis, alcoholism. A subarachnoid hemorrhage. This is where blood gets into that subarachnoid space. And again, they can be exaggerated as well. Maybe because there's compression of that cervical spinal cord. Something happening with those motor tracts. This is a pathological reflex in anybody over the age of 18 months. Babinski sign. So what you do is you take something and stroke the lateral outer margin of the bottom of somebody's foot. The toes all kind of extend and kind of fan out. This is normal in anybody under 1.5 years old, under that 18 months. Why? Because their nerves are not fully myelinated yet. If you see this in anybody over the age of 1.5 or 18 months, this means there is some sort of damage to that cortical spinal tract. A normal response is bending of those toes, curling those toes under. That is a normal or a negative Babinski. This is something, if you've ever watched them test a newborn, they do some different reflex tests on newborns. This is one of them that they check on every newborn. And then they will check it again as your child ages when they go in for their checkups. Here's a fun one. An abdominal reflex. So when you stroke the abdomen around that umbilicus, it'll cause those muscles to contract and pull that umbilicus towards the direction of that stimulus. So here's that umbilicus. So you'd stroke here, you could stroke here, you can stroke here, and you can stroke here. Kind of like a box around it. This reflex may be absent, or damage to it again is absent reflex is that cortical spinal tract, because that's carrying some of our reflex information. Could be lesions, damage to those peripheral nerves. The integrating center or multiple sclerosis. That is that autoimmune condition where your immune system is attacking the myelin sheath of neurons. As I mentioned, the only pupillary light reflex that we can check, or the only autonomic reflex we can check, is the pupillary light reflex. There, said it. So an absence of that pupillary light reflex could mean brain damage, or there could be injury to the arc of those synapses that cause that contraction or that pupil constricting, getting smaller. So let's look at some different spinal cord injuries. So there's a lot of different things that can cause spinal cord injuries. Automobile accidents, falls, contact sports, diving, violence. And depending on where the damage is in the spinal cord will determine what will work. Someone who has monoplasia means they have paralysis of one arm. Mono means one. So only one arm or one limb is non-functional. Diplasia, di means two. So both upper arms or both lower limbs are not functional. Paraplasia is specific to both lower legs. Hemi means it is arm and leg and that trunk on that one side of the body. Quadriplegia means all four. Test question. One of those, knowing what those all mean. So what happens if there is a complete transection of the spinal cord? Transection means that all sensory and motor below that spot is no longer working. Nothing works below that transection level. So between C1 and C3, no function from the neck down. They need a ventilator to breathe, an electronic wheelchair that they can use their head, shoulder, because your shoulders can move thanks to one of your cranial nerves. We'll talk about that when we get to the next chapter, but you can technically move your shoulders because of one of the cranial nerves that come down that allow you to move your head and your shoulders slightly. C4 and C5, you can breathe. C6, C7, you can move some of your arms, some of your chest, so you can actually feed yourself. You can do some dressing, but you're going to need help, and you can use possibly a manual wheelchair. T1 to T3, you have full arm function. T4 to T9, you have control above the umbilicus. T10 to T1, or T10 to L1, you'll have some of your thigh muscles, which means you could possibly walk with braces. L1, L2 means most of your legs will move, so you can use shorter braces. So this was kind of just an interesting image from the textbook. There we go. It kind of shows what people need depending on where their damage occurred. So a hemisection. That is a partial transection of the spinal cord on either the right or the left side. This is known as Brown-Séquard syndrome. So in Brown-Séquard syndrome, they're going to have these three. They can have loss of proprioception, so where their joints are in space, and fine touch sensations on that same side of the body that injury is on. Because most of the nerves that cross the spinal cord to go to the opposite side of the brain, that actually happens up in the brainstem. You can have damage to that lateral cortical spinal tract, which causes same-sided paralysis. You can't move those muscles. Damage to that spinal thalamic tract going to cause loss of pain and temperature sensations. Spinal shock is somebody who spinal cord damage. It's usually an immediate response to some sort of injury, but it usually over time will come back. It's just kind of one of those shock, something that happens that because your body is just so overwhelmed with some sort of injury that happened. Areflexia is a loss of reflex function due to spinal shock. This can begin within an hour after the injury, and it can last several minutes to several months. Spinal compression, spinal cord compression. There's certain things that can cause compression of the spinal cord, like a fractured vertebrae, a herniated intervertebral disc, tumors that are growing into that spinal column, osteoporosis. Somebody with osteoporosis, we mentioned it in the skeletal chapter. Their bones, if they get one of those pathological fractures where their vertebrae just kind of collapse down, it can actually cause spinal cord compression or even infections that get into that spinal column. If we can determine the source of the spinal cord compression before that nervous tissue dies, we can usually reverse it. But you got to find the source pretty quickly. Shingles. You younger generations should have all had the chickenpox vaccine. If you've had the chickenpox vaccine, you're pretty safe from shingles. Those of us who had chickenpox as a child, this is caused by this herpes zosters virus from people who, and it's the same virus that causes chickenpox. What this virus does, after you get over this virus infection, chickenpox, viruses tend to just go hide out and lay dormant in our body sometimes, and then they like to just come out randomly. Certain viruses like to do this. Herpes zoster is one of them. So it will go hide in one of those dorsal root ganglions. And some kind of stressful event, something can trigger reactivation of this virus. And what it is going to do is for that whatever spinal ganglion was hidden in, it is going to travel along that dermatome, cause pain, discolored skin, blisters, along that specific dermatome that virus was hiding in. This is these shingles blisters that are caused from this virus. Those of you who had the chickenpox vaccine don't have to worry about it. Those of you who had chickenpox as a kid, you should be, as you get older, you're going to need to get that shingles vaccine to prevent this. Because I've been told it's extremely painful from people who have had it. Polio. Poliomyelitis is caused by the polio virus. We have pretty well eradicated it from this country. It is still prevalent in third world countries. So if you ever travel to certain third world countries, always check the CDC recommended vaccination list. Because nobody, if you're probably under the age of 50, you were not vaccinated from polio because they're able to completely eradicate it. So just kind of as an public service announcement, you should always check, if you're traveling to different countries, you should always check those vaccination lists because polio still has outbreaks around the world. And what polio does is it can cause paralysis by destroying the cell bodies of motor neurons. It can go in and destroy those cell bodies that go to your diaphragm and or to your heart, and it can cause respiratory or heart failure because it can actually go into the breathing or heart centers of the brainstem. Post-polio syndrome, we shouldn't see if you're going, depending on where you're going into healthcare, you may not see this much longer, maybe in the next decade, two at most. People that were alive when polio was first introduced into this country are getting up there in age now. But several decades after, these people start to get this muscle weakness, fatigue, loss of function, pain, and it's this slow degeneration of these motor neurons. Some sort of stressful event can trigger this post-polio syndrome to come out and start causing problems. And that is everything for this chapter. Thank you very much for listening and have a wonderful day.